Hello again and Merry Christmas. In just 6 days, Christians around the world will be celebrating the birth of Jesus. Matthew chapter 2 and Luke chapter 2 document this amazing point in history, and we read that Joseph and Mary had to leave Nazareth at the worst possible time, when she was great with child. But they didn't have a choice. Caesar Augustus sent out a decree that all the world should be taxed. And since Joseph was of the lineage of David, he had to return to Bethlehem to register. After arriving in Bethlehem, there was no room at the inn, so Mary brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger. And the most often read passage at Christmas time, there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you, ye shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. Matthew chapter 2 tells us that after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Now, when King Herod heard this, he was worried, so he sent them to Bethlehem to search for the young child. The wise men were instructed to then return to Herod and tell him where Jesus was, so he could worship him also. When the wise men found Jesus, they fell down and worshiped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. After leaving Jesus and his family, God warned the wise men in a dream not to return to Herod, and he also warned Joseph in a dream to leave Bethlehem and go to Egypt and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. Now, most of us have heard that story hundreds of times, but imagine you've never heard it before, and you're in a family of rowdy kids, and you know Christmas is Jesus' birthday, but this is the very first time you've ever heard about the shepherds, the wise men, the star, the stable, the crowded inn, or King Herod. Now, let me be a little more specific about being rowdy. The Herdmans were absolutely the worst kids in the history of the world. They lied and stole and smoked cigars, even the girls, and talked dirty and hit little kids and cussed their teachers and took the name of the Lord in vain and set fire to Fred Shoemaker's old broken down tool house. That kind of rowdy. This quote is from The Best Christmas Pageant Ever, written by Barbara Robinson in 1971. Every year when our kids were younger, I would read this book to them while we made the 9-hour Christmas drive to see their grandparents in Ohio. And what a great tradition it was. But anyway, the Herdmans were infamous, and all the other kids were afraid of them. Their father left when the youngest was 2 years old, and their mother worked double shifts in order to avoid being at home with the kids. So the children basically raised themselves kind of like a pack of wild wolves. There are 6 Herdman kids: Ralph, Imogene, Leroy, Claude, Ollie, and Gladys. And they had never been to church and had never read a single Bible story in their lives. Now, every December, this little town put on a Christmas pageant, and Helen Armstrong was always the director. Each year, she chose the same children to play the same characters, and Alice Wendelkin always played Mary. Unfortunately, Miss Armstrong breaks her leg, ends up in the hospital, and Mrs. Bradley somehow ends up running the show. And as time for the pageant gets closer, Mrs. Bradley's son Charlie makes the mistake of telling Leroy Herdman, who's always stealing desserts from Charlie's lunchbox, that he gets all the snacks, donuts and cookies and things like that at church, everything that he wants. And this resulted in the Herdman clan showing up to Sunday school the next Sunday, and it was a disaster. Not only did they steal the money from the collection plate as it passed their way, it was the Sunday that Mrs. Bradley was to choose all of the characters that would be in the Christmas pageant. Now, long story short, Imogen volunteers to be Mary, threatens Alice Windlekin so she doesn't volunteer. Ralph ends up being Joseph. Leroy, Claude, and Ollie volunteer to be the wise men, and little Gladys volunteers to be the angel of the Lord. Now, Gladys was the worst herdman of all because she was the youngest, and the older ones taught her everything that they knew. Of course, this was the biggest scandal this little town had ever seen, and the complaints start rolling into the church. Reverend Hopkins finally gets tired of the whole mess and all the complaining and reminds everyone that when Jesus said, "Suffer the little children to come unto me," Jesus meant all the little children, including the herdmans, and that pretty much shut everyone up. But the first night of rehearsals, they got there about 10 minutes late, sliding into the room like a bunch of outlaws about to shoot up a saloon. And since not one of the herdmans had a clue about the Christmas story, Mrs. Bradley had to explain everything from the beginning. When they heard that there was no room for Mary and Joseph in the inn, Imogen could not believe it and said, "Not even for Jesus?" and asked why Mary didn't tell the innkeeper and what in the world was the matter with Joseph that he didn't tell them with her being pregnant and everything. Then Claude wanted to know what Mrs. Bradley meant by wadded up clothes, and then she had to kind of correct herself and said swaddling clothes, and told him that people used to wrap their babies up tightly in big pieces of material to keep them snug. Well, this was the worst thing Imogen could imagine, and she wondered why child welfare wasn't involved with the family who tied up their baby and put him in a feed box, because child welfare showing up at the herdman house was a normal thing. So when the time came to explain the wise men to the herdmans, they kind of got excited because they thought maybe these important guys would tell the innkeeper off and get baby Jesus out of that barn. But when the herdmans heard about the gifts the wise men brought, they got angry. And when Mrs. Bradley explained that frankincense and myrrh were precious oils, Imogen couldn't believe it. She got angry and wanted to know what kind of cheap king hands out oil for a present. So you'll have to read the book to find out what Leroy thought was a much better gift than precious oils, which he ends up bringing and plopping down in front of baby Jesus on pageant night. Then came the worst of the worst, King Herod. When they heard that Herod planned to kill Jesus, the herdmans wanted to know all about him. The other kids thought they knew why the herdmans were so interested in this Christmas villain, and they were convinced that this rowdy crew probably liked Herod, and that he may have even been one of their distant ancestors, Herod Herdman. But they were wrong. The herdmans were actually hoping that somebody would be cast as King Herod so they could beat him up on pageant night. And after the first night of rehearsals, Mr. Bradley wanted to know everything that happened, and Mrs. Bradley answered him by saying this: "Just suppose you had never heard the Christmas story and didn't know anything about it, and then somebody told it to you. What would you think?" Most of us have grown up hearing about the Christmas story and probably can recite every little detail, but maybe we've heard it so many times that we've forgotten the reality of it, or maybe we never even thought about the reality of it. Mary and Joseph had to leave Nazareth, like I said, at the worst possible time, and they had to walk about 90 miles, which would have been about an 8-hour day for 4 days in a row. And they probably had little to no money, definitely had nowhere to stay once they got there. All of the photos that I've ever seen depicting Mary and baby Jesus portray a beautiful Mary dressed in blue with a veil, rosy cheeks, and looking very clean and holy, when in reality, both her and Joseph probably looked a lot more like refugees running from a violent dictator. They were most likely dirty, sweaty, hungry, thirsty, and definitely exhausted. Mary had just had her baby either in a cave or a barn-like structure under the most unsanitary conditions, and had to lay Jesus in an animal feeding trough. And if that wasn't bad enough, a bunch of shepherds come barging in, all excited, right after she'd had her baby. And then there was Herod wanting to kill Jesus. Matthew chapter 2, verse 16 documents the massacre of the innocents, in which Herod, after being deceived by the wise men, sent his own soldiers to Bethlehem and killed every male child under the age of 2. Seriously, the whole thing was a nightmare. From the moment he was born, Jesus was basically hunted down by those in power, and yet this perfect, sinless Son of God willingly came to earth in the form of an innocent baby for you and me. So as you're finalizing your Christmas Eve and Christmas Day plans and doing last-minute shopping and gift wrapping, maybe take a few minutes to think about the reality of that very first Christmas. As I reread the Christmas story, I started thinking about the song Silent Night, and I do not think everything was calm and bright on that first Christmas. I think it was chaos. Maybe it was a beautiful chaos, but chaos nevertheless. And this Christmas, I hope each of us can look at Jesus' birth a little differently, maybe look at it from the herdman perspective, like it's the first time we've ever heard the story. And in what turns out to be chaos many times in our own Christmas celebrations and traditions, I hope we can focus on our blessings, on all the things we have to be thankful for, and remember just how Jesus came into this world under the most amazing but humble of circumstances. Next week, I'll be talking about the big picture and how important it is for us to get our priorities in the right order. And in that video, I'll share one of the most epic and embarrassing parental fails of my life, a moment that I'll always be ashamed of, and how my priorities were turned completely upside down. So until next time, remember, God loves you, and keep your eyes on Jesus. Merry Christmas, and thank you so much for watching.